Joining us now, CNN political commentator and attorney Bakari Sellers. Also with us, retired LAPD Police Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey. She's the author of the book Black and Blue. Great to have both of you. Sergeant Dorsey, I want to start with you. What were you struck by listening to Chief Arradondo describe policy and describe the kind of ethos of the police department?
Well, what struck me is, number one, he said it, and that was great. It needed to be said, particularly from someone in his position. But it's a little too late. It would have been nice. After all, Derek Chauvin had 18 personnel complaints. Had the police chief maybe had him ride the desk or saddled him to the kit room instead of allowing him to be out in patrol. And so now they're still in damage control mode, and they're doing what they have to do to appease the public and the family of George Floyd. After all, the city did pay out $27 million to the family.
Counselor Bakari Sellers, the fact of this testimony, the fact of so much testimony from police, it's really unusual. It is really unusual in this type of situation. Explain that and explain the likely impact on the jury.
I mean, it's unheard of in my experience, but my experience isn't as vast as some other members of the bar, I can say that much. But you very rarely, if ever, see law enforcement officer after officer after officer testify against one of their own. And these are every rank, including the chief, coming out and testifying and not only saying that he violated policy, but distancing themselves from him. This is, it's like he was thrown out of the blue wall. Derek Chauvin was just tossed over the blue wall and left to fend for himself. And so this is going to be very powerful because law enforcement officers get the benefit of the doubt times 10 in cases like this. And so the prosecutors have to separate Derek Chauvin from what law enforcement officers are known to do, traditionally do, and what they do under the law, because they get a lot of rope. In this case, though, there is going to be a lot of distance between the law enforcement community and Derek Chauvin, and that distance is being driven by other law enforcement officers, and it's pretty refreshing to see.
But Bakari, one more question about the court case. I mean, when you hear the police chief and the person who's in charge of training say this violates department policy, it is completely outside the realm of our training, what more? I mean, isn't that sort of case closed? Doesn't that just sort of destroy the defense case from where you sit as an attorney?
No, in fact, it's far from it. Now, that helps build the case. I think yesterday was the strongest day that the prosecution has had, no doubt about it. However, there still is a major argument about cause of death. Now, to those of us sitting on this panel, we would say that the knee on the back of George Floyd's neck was the cause of death. However, the criminal defense attorney is going to sit there and make that as murky as possible and say that drugs had a large role to play, and that but for the fact that he had fentanyl and methamphetamines in his system, George Floyd would be alive today. Now, I'm not sure that that's going to fly, because I would articulate that but for the fact there was a knee in the back of his neck, he would be alive today. But that is going to be the argument that the criminal defense attorney is going to try to make. And look, Allison, you and I and John aren't in that jury room right now. Those are wild cards, as Laura Coates always says, and it only takes one of them to be steadfast in their belief that George Floyd somehow killed himself or contributed to his own death.
Sergeant Dorsey, if I can go back for a second to your area of expertise, obviously serving in the police for so long, Bakari said that Derek Chauvin's been tossed over the blue wall by his fellow members of the force and his superior officers. What does it take for something like that to happen? What's the significance of that moment?
A violation of policy. Listen, when we see misconduct and we don't do anything to intervene, when we don't stop misconduct, then we acquiesce misconduct, and that means we're committing it ourselves. And so everyone that took the stand, the sergeant, the lieutenant, the commander, and ultimately the police chief, raised their hand and swore under the penalty of perjury to tell the truth about their training and what officers are expected to do when they encounter citizens. And so they did that. This is not anything unique and unusual. It's just that we're seeing it for the very first time play out live on television.
And Sergeant Dorsey, what did you think about the person talking? I mean, the woman who trains the police in terms of use of force to say that's an improvised move. I mean, is that, in your experience, knee on the neck? Would somebody use that? Is that something that he came up with?
It's certainly something that he came up with, and the commander described it properly by saying it was something that was improvised. There is a technique that we use when we approach a felony-prone suspect who's laying down on the ground from the head. You put your knee between the shoulder blade, only long enough to put handcuffs on, and then once the handcuffs go on, then you get up off that person, and that should happen fairly quickly. It didn't in this case. It lasted for over 9 minutes, and she attested to that.
Bakari, you've been talking about, in a way, how the prosecution's trying to set up this case and block, in some ways, all the defense outs that they're going to try when they get to present their case. And you talk about the importance of the drug use, the fentanyl, maybe the methamphetamine. And you used a phrase that I want you to explain a little bit more. But for the presence of the knee on the neck. What's the importance of that, and why will the prosecution lean into that?
I mean, the prosecution is going to lean into the fact because they have to show that the knee in the neck was a substantial factor in the death of George Floyd. I mean, now, there can be multiple causes of death. However, this knee has to be the substantial cause of death of George Floyd. And so, you know, when you use words like but for, the prosecution is going to say, look, there was a knee in his neck. He did have, and I can literally hear the closing argument right now in my head. Derek Chauvin did have his knee in his neck. He did use improper training. Blah, 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 blah. The list goes on and on and on. But George Floyd had drugs in the system, and but for those drugs, George Floyd would still be alive today. That's going to be the argument that the jury is going to take back in the room with them. He's also going to try to throw up things like, you know, Derek Chauvin was, you know, kind of fearful because there was a crowd. We all know that to be BS. But still, those arguments are not going to be central to the main argument, which is about cause of death, and that is going to be the crux of the criminal defense argument moving forward. This is still a long way to go. It's not like the prosecution gets to make their case and we go home. The criminal defense attorney is going to have a week or so to put forth his case, and it's going to be interesting to see whether or not he's able to do that successfully, and whether or not Derek Chauvin testifies.
Bakari Sellers, Sergeant Dorsey, thank you both very much for all of your experience that you're sharing with us. Okay, meanwhile, thousands of fans packing the stadium at last night's Texas Rangers home opener. It was the largest sports gathering in the U.S. since the pandemic began. We bring you the details next.